Congresswoman, thanks for coming in.
Absolutely. Delighted to be here.
We're going to jump in on the assumption that people by now ought to have an idea of who you are and what you're about. So we will start with questions.
Sure.
So
Sounds good.
The first one is, so you've been in Congress for several sessions now. And people seem to feel that Washington just continues to become more and more dysfunctional. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you have done to combat that and what you might do moving forward to change the dynamic
Sure.
in Congress.
Well, start with elections matter, and this president has been very, very divisive. I think literally everything that comes out of his mouth, but certainly everything that comes from his tweets have inflamed the polarization in Washington to a detrimental effect. What I've tried to do, and I think been successful at, is the New Hampshire approach of bringing people together to get things done, despite the rhetoric and despite the polarization in Washington. And the other thing that's led to the last 2 years being more difficult than the first 4 when I was in Congress under the Obama administration is that the Republicans right now control the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and ironically, nothing gets done. I say ironically because you'd think if they controlled all 3, they could move a legislative agenda. But let me just give you one example. Immigration, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but 5.5 years ago, the Senate passed a very comprehensive, very bipartisan immigration bill. John McCain voted for it, Kelly Ayotte voted for it, Jeanne Shaheen voted for it, and yet we haven't had a single hearing under Speaker John Boehner or Speaker Paul Ryan to solve what is quite obviously a very challenging issue that needs attention. So what I've done is bring people together to get the job done, and I've chosen issues that are critically important to New Hampshire. But we've been able to make progress in Washington, perhaps flying under the radar a bit. And the best example is on the opioid epidemic, where New Hampshire is number 1, 2, or 3, depending upon if you're counting deaths from fentanyl, number 1 in the entire nation in percentage of deaths per population. I created a bipartisan task force to combat, well, at that point, the heroin epidemic. Now we call it the opioid task force. We have 105 members of Congress working together. Half are Democrat, half are Republican. And it's designed that way purposefully. Whenever a new Democrat comes on, we say we've got to get another Republican on board. It'll give you a sense of the scope of this problem that many congressional districts are impacted. But I have to say, with a touch of irony, you won't hear about it or read about it because it's not sufficiently controversial. I mean, the controversy gets the media coverage. But we actually work together, and the rules of the task force are that any bill that goes on our agenda has to have bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support. And what I do is hold monthly sessions that educate the members about substance use disorder, about pain management, about law enforcement, all different aspects. And I'm proud to say in June we passed 54 bills in 1 week. It's probably more bills than the rest of the session combined on everything from prevention and education, increasing access to treatment, that's critically important here in New Hampshire, long-term recovery, and then law enforcement, making sure they have the tools to deal with these synthetic opioids and the testing equipment. So that's the best example. The second best example is on veterans. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, which is probably the last most bipartisan committee in Congress. And we have dozens of bills that we've sent to the president for his signature that are bipartisan. I was one of 2 Democrats on the VA Mission Act to try to correct the problems that we've had with care in the community. Critically important here in New Hampshire. I worked with Senator Sullivan, a Republican from Alaska, those are the 2 states without full service hospitals, so we have special considerations that every veteran in New Hampshire that's eligible for care is allowed to go into the community for care. And I can get into more detail, but I went to the White House for that signing ceremony. Again, very bipartisan. So the president has a certain level of vitriol and partisanship, and underneath the layers, we're working together on certain issues very, very well. And the third one would be the Farm Bill. We're not there yet, but I'm on the Agriculture Committee, also very bipartisan. Although this year that's been more difficult than the first Farm Bill I did 5 years ago was completely bipartisan. This year, our chairman made it more partisan, and we've worked with the Senate on the Committee of Conference to come up with a Farm Bill that serves everybody's needs. So I would say, yes, it's a very polarized environment, but by bringing this New Hampshire approach of bringing people together, we can really make progress.
So just building up the opioid solutions you've been talking about. Obviously, you address law enforcement and treatment. I was kind of wondering what ideas on those are obviously kind of on the supply side of things, especially on the law enforcement end, where they're trying to crack down on dealers and distribution. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering on the demand side, what ideas have you been hearing about, or you think are feasible in terms of just reducing the public's need for consumption, whether it's CBD oil or you see what's again.
Well, I think the most important one is addressing the high rate of opioid prescriptions, and I always talk about a book called Dreamland, and I think you all had read it last time when we spoke, but if you haven't, you should. And it's what happened, how opioids became such a preferred pain medication for everything from dentist to surgery to ER to OR to and my husband's just had knee surgery, and you have to fight not to have OxyContin, oxycodone. Every other person that walks into the room is trying to give that as the preferred pain medication. And we have a serious problem, and so people should have alternatives, and we need to address Purdue Pharma and the pharmaceutical companies that push this on people, and we need to address the protocols that physicians use, and New Hampshire's made a good step toward that, but we should be doing that at the national level, and that's part of our package. We've got good research going on up at Dartmouth Medical School and at the VA about alternative pain management, using acupuncture, using the whole mental health component of it. 4 out of 5 heroin users have a co-occurring mental health disorder, and they haven't been treated for that. So they're in essence self-medicating anxiety, depression, but also trauma. I meet a lot of people in recovery who had some type of trauma, either sexual assault in their youth or domestic violence. I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee, so we meet a lot of people with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma, and we've got to address those issues. So there's a lot that can be done. New Hampshire has a lot of bold ideas and innovative solutions, and that's what I've been doing, is trying to bring people from New Hampshire down to our task force and educate. The Safe Stations program in Nashua and Manchester has been very, very helpful, getting people access to treatment. And then one that I'm very excited about is from Sullivan County and now over in Merrimack County, that is offering substance use treatment during incarceration and mental health treatment. And this goes back to Medicaid stops the day you enter into any kind of jail or prison facility. And as a result, not surprisingly, there's very little access to treatment. And then people come out and we all act shocked, totally shocked that they've gone back to their addiction. And the point is, that's actually a really good time for treatment. people have time, they can show up, they don't have to worry about getting a ride or a snowstorm or whether they have a babysitter, they can focus on their own well-being. And this program stays with the person for a year after. So support services of job training and getting a good job and transportation and childcare and housing. And they drop the recidivism rate for people going right back to jail from the 80th percentile to the 20th percentile. So I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, that's a better use of our tax dollars. And we're going to be looking into expanding that. Ross Cunningham is the person that put this together, and he came down and testified. There's a great deal that could be done on the demand side. People are not choosing. They don't wake up in the morning wanting to grow up to be a heroin addict. There is a process, and the people that I've met that got into it through opioid prescribing, legitimate prescribing for pain, but it went on for too long or the dose was too much and they became just, pulled into it. And the best line I heard is that the organ that you need to solve the problem is the organ that's ill. And so you make really bad decisions, and it's very hard for your family, and there's a very high rate of relapse, even after treatment. So we've got to get at the bottom of that, get better access to treatment.
Yeah. Just to follow up, as you mentioned acupuncture as one method, would you also be in favor of some sort of limited decriminalization or legalization of things like marijuana, even if it's like a CBD oil that doesn't make people intoxicated?
What I really would love to see with that is better research. I'm disappointed that we don't have, particularly now that we've had legalization in Colorado, in Oregon, in Washington, I have not seen solid research, and I think part of that has to do, we have to change the federal law about using the marijuana during the research, sort of ironic twist, but because I have heard anecdotally people suggesting that, but I would, before we take that in a broad application, I would definitely want to see scientific research behind it, but I do understand the concept of lessening anxiety, which I think can happen for some people. In other people, marijuana can heighten anxiety. So it's a question of maybe it's what works best for the patient.
Well, I was mentioning it doesn't actually have any kind of, cerebral intoxicating effect. It's mostly just for pain relief. But researching that would involve declassifying marijuana.
Right, that's what I'm suggesting.
Drug,
I think
right?
we need to declassify so that we can do the research.
Gotcha.
So that we can determine what is the best application. But I'm open to, I'm working with, again, it's a research out of Dartmouth Medical School. Some of the best people in the country are researching there. And then also with veterans at White River Junction. And there's an excellent physician named Dr. Julie Franklin. She took a group of veterans with chronic pain that were on very high doses of OxyContin, oxycodone. One of them was taking 160 pills per month. And she introduced, there's sort of more flexibility in that environment. Everything's not so siloed. So she could bring in acupuncture, she could bring in physical therapy, mental health therapy, group therapy, hiking, mindfulness, yoga. They tried all different kinds of things. And they were able to cut the use of the opioid medication in half in this group. And when I met them, much better quality of life. This guy was back out logging. He had gotten remarried. He just had, totally blossomed. And some of them, New Hampshire has 65,000 Vietnam-era veterans, and they'd never had any kind of mental health treatment for their PTSD or trauma during the war. And just getting them into group therapy or individual therapy can go a long way toward people feeling better and having a higher quality of life and not be relying on pain medication.
On the topic of healthcare, specifically the Affordable Care Act, that's been continued to have been challenged in the courts and legislatively, and you've spoken about the negative impacts of repealing the act as well as its flaws. At this point, what do you think needs to be done, and what action would you take to that end?
Sure. Again, elections have consequences, but I will say for the record, I have voted 53 times not to repeal the Affordable Care Act. My opponent wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and in particular, I'm very concerned about the threat to people with pre-existing conditions, whether that's anything from asthma all the way through to substance use disorder, Alzheimer's. I think that would be a terrible step back. Having said that, the Affordable Care Act isn't perfect, and of course it needs modifications. Anything that comes along, Social Security, Medicare, over the years has been tinkered with. So I worked with a group of New Democrats. We had a healthcare task force that I helped to co-chair, and we came up with proposals for stabilizing the insurance markets using reinsurance for the most expensive cases so that all the ratepayers aren't paying for the most expensive cases. There are a small percentage of people that use a lot of healthcare dollars, and we can even that out using a product called reinsurance. We also talked about making sure that the cost reduction payments are made under the Affordable Care Act. This administration has stopped making those payments, and that makes a great deal of uncertainty. Healthcare providers and insurers would be dropping out of the system, so I want to make sure we stabilize that. And then I worked with Senator Shaheen on a bill that passed into law to make healthcare more of an option for small group employers, for employers that New Hampshire is 90% small employers, small businesses, and I want to make sure they also have access. But the biggest change
Just
that...
ask quickly, what's small?
That was the point, the definition at 50 rather than 100. So making sure that more employers would fall within that. One of the things that I think could be considered is to offer what's sometimes referred to as a public option on the exchange, and that would be Medicare. Most people I talk to, Medicare works quite well for them. They can choose their doctor or provider will accept the reimbursement, and they feel that they have choice. One exception, just a minor tangent, that's a big issue right now, we should negotiate for lower prescription drug prices in Medicare. Medicare Part D doesn't allow for volume discounts, and that was a huge boondoggle giveaway during the Bush administration. I just this morning ran into someone who paid $1,000 for medication for a family member last month, and nobody should have to do that. There's no reason for that. Taxpayers and seniors are paying more. But back to the Affordable Care Act, we could offer Medicare to people at age 50 or 55 paying a premium each month, but that would be their access, that would be their option. And the advantage to that is we would get a chance to see how that works. There wouldn't be an expense to the taxpayer because it would just be, a premium would be paid, but the premium wouldn't be going to an insurance company per se. The premium would be going toward their care. And we would get a sense of whether the system, the healthcare delivery system, can handle that extra volume and whether those rates, reimbursement rates, hold up so that we don't put our healthcare delivery system, which here in New Hampshire is primarily not-for-profit, at risk.
And on another topic of the national debt in the trillions now, one of the drivers is entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid. What do you think should be done about the cost, if anything, of these entitlement programs?
Well, let me start with the biggest driver, which was the irresponsible tax break that was ushered in by the Republicans and President Trump, because that's what added $1.5 trillion to the debt and almost to $1 trillion to the deficit. I think $800 billion this year, next year likely to be $1 trillion. So that's the much more irresponsible spending that the Republicans, and the reality is the vast majority of that benefit went to either corporations that are now involved in these stock buybacks and their CEOs are selling the stock and they're making more and more at the top, not in increasing wages to their employees, but also the individual tax breaks, most of them to the trillionaires and billionaires and trillionaires at the top, the 0.1%. So I didn't see that as being responsible spending, if you will. But back to, and I don't consider them entitlements. People paid into Social Security their entire life. So that is a savings mechanism for their retirement. I was a little surprised when my opponent said Social Security is not a retirement program. Tell that to someone who's living off of it. It's not very much money to live off of, but I certainly meet people who live off of it. The Social Security one is easy. All we have to do is raise the cap. The cap right now, I think, is $128,000 for wages below which Social Security is withheld, above which it's not. So there's a fairness issue here. People making $228,000, $328,000, $428,000 have no more taken out of their paychecks than people making $128,000. It's a mathematical issue. You have to take into account the demographics and the age, but there is a point at which it would be sustainable indefinitely. So Social Security is not the problem. We do need to stop raiding the Social Security Trust Fund, and that's another issue. Medicare, I'd start with the negotiating the volume discount on Medicare Part D. Again, I think it was a boondoggle for the pharmaceutical companies under the Bush administration, and I think it's a very expensive mistake for the taxpayers and for seniors. And then I would look at these options of increasing competition among providers to bring down rates. And I think there's a lot that can be done under the Affordable Care Act. And something that is talked about around here in Cheshire County, but also in Vermont next door, are the accountable care organizations that the Affordable Care Act envisioned, where you incentivize the caregivers to around wellness and around their well-being rather than just injury and illness. And there's so much that could be done on the prevention side with the most expensive illnesses for the system. Right now you'd have to add the substance use disorder to it, certainly alcoholism, but drug use, but also diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity. All of those would respond well to prevention. But because we have a pay-for-service model, people aren't incentivized for the prevention, and that caregivers are not incentivized. The caregivers are incentivized around providing care for illness and injury, and we can do so much better.
If I could just ask quickly, you mentioned increasing competition. So how does that work in an area, say, the Monadnock region, where there is no competition?
Yeah, it's more difficult. But certainly we have a lot more...
Is it a leave it to the local people to figure it out, or is it a federal solution that...
I think it's a combination. I think the federal government can incentivize the affordable care, accountable care model, for example, is... Right now, typically, I think that's through a type of exemption through CMS. It's sort of a complicated process, but that certainly can help. But there are others, you say there's no competition, but in fact, there could be some competition. And just using the issue of prescription drugs, there's competition in mail order. There's competition online. There, delivery. People are much more used to that kind of thing now. And even with healthcare, there's a lot more happening over the internet that you'd be surprised. Again, back to the veterans up in the North Country where it's hard to access healthcare. They're using online therapy that is telemedicine that's actually very, very effective. And so that may be something that introduces competition to rural communities.
So regardless of how next month's midterm elections play out,
Yeah.
at least for the next 2 years, we're going to have a Republican president who doesn't believe that our elected leaders should be dealing with the issue of climate change. I wonder if you, to your view, if you could talk about how you view Congress's role relative to the issue, and then also part two, maybe break down a little bit some of the components as you imagine them as part of a national energy strategy as you see it.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying I believe in science. I believe in climate change. I believe our climate is changing and that there are human-made influences that need to be reversed. And most importantly, the discharge of carbon into the climate. And I think we need to do better. I would not have withdrawn the country from the Paris Climate Agreement. I think that was a historic achievement of the Obama administration and Secretary of State John Kerry and others that were participated in that. But I will say, let me start from an optimistic place, which is that fortunately for the planet and future generations, most people have ignored the president's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. And this includes decisions that are being made every day in the Pentagon, in American businesses, in states and cities and localities, in all the other countries in the world. So I don't want to diminish the role of the United States. It's a shame that we've lost our leadership in this. But back to elections do matter, and I feel very strongly that the country would be in a better place if the Democrats took back control of Congress, and this is one of the reasons why, one of the issues. We need to assert oversight over particularly the Environmental Protection Agency, which it's not just the climate, it's everything else. It's lead, it's the quality of our water, it's the quality of our air, it's coal and oil and all of the discharge, all of the carbon that's spewing out from that. And this administration rolling back protections. A good example is the automobile emission standards that they're trying to roll back. The auto industry doesn't even want them to roll that back. The auto industry is saying, we have the technology, give us the standard, we will meet the technology for emission standards, for miles per gallon. We don't want that rolled back. So I think what can happen is Congress can assert oversight. And the other thing about this president, I believe that if we pass bipartisan legislation, and I am a part of a climate solutions caucus that is, again, bipartisan on this issue. There's a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. If we pass legislation, for example, to stick to the emission standards that we had under the Paris Agreement, or to encourage alternative energy because of the growth in jobs and the economic impact, and, oh, by the way, it saves the planet, I believe he'll sign it. And I believe he may take total credit for it, but I think that if we pass bipartisan legislation and get it to his desk, he's so desperate to demonstrate that he's getting something done that he would sign that. So I focus on renewable energy. Look at the surge here in New Hampshire on solar. You know, was it only a few years ago people said, oh, it's too far north? Well, it turns out that's not relevant. If the sun is shining, the solar will work. And I see projects all over the country, all over this district, that are new solar projects, and some of them funded by the federal government, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, with a focus on renewable energy in rural communities. That's going on at the same time.
What about natural gas and this region and this state's reliance on it? You well know that that's been a contentious issue. Is that a piece of the formula to your view?
It's a piece of the formula, but I will say on these big projects, and particularly the pipeline coming across the southern part of the state through 17 towns in my district, they did such a terrible job at the local politics of that, of the siting of that. I mean, when I went down and walked the line and saw where they're intending, it was absolutely ridiculous. It was as though somebody down in Texas had just drawn a line across New Hampshire. Nobody had gotten out of the truck to go look that it was going to cross a stream a dozen times, or that it was going to go right down the middle between a high school and a middle school. I mean, come on, you've got to do better than that. So I think people would do well with projects like that to stick to the corridors that are already developed, to stick to, we have industrial corridors in our state that are going to be much less problematic than coming right through 17 small towns with beautiful, pristine, wildlife areas. They don't need a pipeline down the middle of them. And so part of this is just think it through. But yeah, I mean, I think we need a diverse energy portfolio. But I think if we get the incentives right, that more and more of that will be renewable energy. Again, better for the planet, good for the economy, growing jobs. It's a win-win-win solution.
Would carbon tax be a part of that, as outlined in the UN report?
I think what I would suggest that's been very successful here in New England is carbon trading, like the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, has been very, very successful in New England for bringing down our carbon footprint. And I think that's a better approach, and that's an approach that I would like to see spread nationally.
But do you think that would mitigate the effects of climate change enough in time for like the
Yeah,
2 degree
it's really having a great impact. And I think it's all about incentives right now, and where this administration wants to go is they're incentivizing carbon fuels. They want to go back to coal. They want to go back to, oil. We should be heading in the direction of incentivizing renewable energy. And making sure that at least at a minimum we have a level playing field, so that when the investors don't care. I mean, they want successful projects. And it would surprise you the conversation I had recently with a New Hampshire energy company that is planning to rebrand themselves as a green renewable energy company. And they're very excited about offshore wind. And so the future is happening. New Hampshire got left behind a little bit because we were still trying to deal with the Bow power plant that was running with some coal, and the Schiller plant that was running on, fossil fuels. Now I think you'll see us turn the corner on that, and you'll see much more, for example, bioenergy. I'm the chair of the Bioenergy Caucus in Congress, and that's very successful for New Hampshire. And by the way, win-win-win, jobs for our timber industry, for truckers, for people making the wood chips and all of that. So there's so much more that can be done. There's no reason to go back in time.
When you use the term incentives
Mm-hmm.
or incentivizing, is that the same as subsidizing, subsidies?
Well, it's tax breaks is what it is. So some people do call that tax expenditures. I don't think we need subsidies per se, but right now the oil and gas industry get millions of dollars in tax breaks that are specifically designed that, in terms of our planet, are the worst thing that we should be doing. And so that's why we still have, why anybody is still talking about coal and oil, is because of the tax breaks that they have. I would either make it a level playing field, or with no tax advantages for anybody, or I would incentivize renewable energy so that renewable energy could stand a chance. If you talk to investors, they're looking at projects that are going to be successful, and they understand that the climate is changing and that people want a healthy planet, and so their preference would be to go in that direction. But if you're looking at the math of a project, and this oil or coal project has tax breaks that benefit them, that's going to tilt the equation. But I'll tell you an example. I was out in Vancouver for a renewable energy conference and climate with Republicans, by the way, colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and environmentalists, and leading researchers, and industry. And we had the international CEO of Honda, and it was in August, and it happened to be the week that the White House was rolling back the auto emission standards. And he was saying, no, don't do that. This is a long-term, we have spent years planning to meet that standard. We have the technology. And Honda, of all companies, that's part of their marketing, is green, we're better for the environment. You get more miles to the gallon. Our auto emission standard is better. And he's saying, do not roll this back. So I think the president is out of step with the best economic decisions and certainly environmental considerations.
So another issue that's particularly acute in this region and parts of the state is 21st century infrastructure, or
Yes.
broadband.
Yes.
And let's just say that it's less than wonderful
Yes.
in parts of this region.
Trust
So-
me, I know. Dropping a call 9 times coming over here.
So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you've done and what you can imagine doing going
Sure.
forward that would ensure rural residents of this region of the state have
Yeah.
access to broadband.
Well, right now, what I'm most concerned about is the FCC reaching the conclusion on their maps that there is great service here. And I'm focused on working with the local community on they're going out measuring the quality of sound so that we can demonstrate that there is not full service here. And it's not just Cheshire County, but this goes over to Hillsborough County. Peterborough has got a lot of issues. Working with a woman named Jeannie Deach, who's now running for state senate, and she's been very active in that project. But more broadly, we have been talking both to the companies and to the communities about how to come together and make it economically viable to come in here with better broadband. I think that's the bottom line, is you have to make it in their interest. I'll tell you an example from up north where they were having similar problems in Coos County, and we were able to bring together and get some federal funding in for them to put up, I think they started out with 4 towers around Coos County, and then they're putting the intermediate towers up. And you'd be surprised, but they have very fast, very accessible broadband communication. The cell phones are better, the computers are better. And so I think we need something like that, and just working with the economic development interests here in Cheshire County, Monadnock region, and offering our services for identifying federal funds to come in and help with that project. And it just has to be the private sector working with the public sector, getting everybody together to get that done. But I think it's a serious issue. We have forums, and it impacts everybody. It impacts the schools. We had a forum with realtors over in Peterborough, and they have $400,000 homes that they can't sell because they don't have broadband communication at the home, and that's an issue. I think this goes beyond broadband to all of infrastructure, and that was one of the more shocking things. My opponent said he didn't see a federal role for infrastructure. We were talking about roads and bridges and highways and funding that I've brought to the state, $200 million to finish off I-93 and help with red-listed bridges, some of which are over here. I can remember going out with DOT at the bridge headed down toward Winchester, getting the funding to fix that. But also bringing rail to Nashua. That could impact this community, bringing the rail up further. And obviously the east-west driving, to try to get from Keene to Manchester or Nashua. So I think it's definitely going to need federal funding. And I think my goal is for every dollar that we send to Washington, we get at least $1 back, that our tax dollars are supporting these projects all across the country. Let's make sure that we get the benefit in better highways, safer bridges, better infrastructure, and broadband is certainly a part of that.
Yeah, and so in our reporting, we've talked to a lot of experts on this issue, and many of them say there's not a single greater impediment to the workforce development challenges that the state in broadband. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I mean, it's a combination. If you don't have roads and bridges and highways, whenever I go out and I get a chance to visit dozens of companies, we're probably in the hundreds at this point, but we call it Congress in Your Company, and I go in and get a tour and meet with employees, meet with management, and I'll ask them, what's your biggest impediment to growth? The two things right now are the workforce, because our unemployment is so low. They need a trained workforce for the 21st century jobs, and then the infrastructure. So, for example, every time they have people stuck in traffic who can't get to work or home to their families, or goods that can't get to market, that's an impediment for them. And if you look at 101, that's a problem. We can do better. Certainly 101 east of Manchester is a major improvement in the quality of people's lives. And if we could make some improvements like that west of Manchester, I think we could make a difference in, people don't want to spend 45 minutes in the car trying to get to work and back. They want to get home and help with homework and have a nice dinner and go to Little League games and, have a life. That's why they came to New Hampshire. But certainly, broadband comes up frequently.
So it is the overwhelming conclusion of the intelligence community that Russia attempted to interfere and did interfere in the 2016 election. I was wondering if you could just talk about what the proper steps in Congress would be in some context, at least for New Hampshire. Was I spoke with Secretary of State Gardner yesterday, and he actually touted the state's paper ballot system and a lack of an online voter registry as part of how where he argued we were the most, we're a fortress, is the word he used, against Russian interference. But for the rest of the country and going forward, how do you think you could sort of restore some faith in the election process, and how do you convince people who think this just didn't happen or it's a hoax?
That's a good question in terms of how you convince people who think it didn't happen. I think if the president stopped calling it a hoax, that would probably be a good place to start. I completely believe the intelligence community that the Russians did interfere with the election. I think what you'll hear some Republicans say is that there's not evidence that the vote tallies were changed.
Right.
But certainly the interference in the election process, that happened to me. I mean, if we looked at polling 2 weeks out and I was 13 points ahead, and election night I win by 4 points, and it was the Comey letter and all of the issues that had come out around that. And we now know that the Russians were behind the whole thing about the emails and all of that. So you can't convince me otherwise that they didn't impact the election. What we need to do about that is broad. I mean, part of that is working with the high tech and the communications, Facebook and such, about their procedures and their protocols so that they can identify when Russian bots are pumping out disinformation campaigns. Part of it does go to the integrity of the election process, and I beg to differ a bit with Secretary of State Gardner. Yes, in some ways we're safer with paper ballots, that's true, but you can have a ballot system that has a paper ballot trail, and at least you can have a backup system for that. And the problem is that by his efforts to sort of keep us in the 1950s, we discourage people from voting. I think we should have early voting. I think we should have open up voting so that people feel encouraged. And I'm glad the court took the stand that they did this week, that overburdensome regulation of voting just is detrimental to our democracy. It doesn't. We don't have a fraud problem here. What we have is people that are discouraged from voting and participating in the democracy. So that's a much bigger concern. But what we've looked at, two parts to this. One is a Democratic agenda that we will bring in as part of the first thing we do in January if we take back the House. And it's called We the People, and it has to do with election integrity. It has to do with campaign finance reform and coping with the dark money that pours into our elections. Again, I was a victim of that. The Koch brothers spent $4 million against me in 2014, but some of these you can't even tell who the money is coming from. So I think we need much greater regulation and disclosure and transparency in that. And then part of it is about election reform and making sure that voting rights are respected, and that people, what's going on right now in Georgia with hundreds of thousands of people purged from the rolls, or North Dakota where people are not able to vote. They have to have a street address, but it turns out on the reservation, the Native American population don't have street addresses. They have P.O. boxes. So now, there seems to be an intention to try to keep certain groups from voting. And then making sure that our cybersecurity is robust, and that I've been actually shocked that my colleagues in the Republican Congress have not taken greater steps on this. We should have federal funding for our Secretary of State, for every state in the country, to shore up their election system and their voting systems and the mechanics behind it, and make sure that it's secure. And we shouldn't just say, everybody go back to the paper ballot because that's the solution. I mean, that may be one step in having security or redundancy in the process, that you can go back and count paper ballots, but that shouldn't keep us from making elections as efficient and effective as possible.
Just real quickly, while we have you here, we had a story today with Secretary Gardner saying that people complain about kind of the era of poll taxes and pretty much explicit voter suppression on the laws, before the Civil Rights era. But he was kind of arguing that people today, the term he got targeted back to was they don't have the will to vote. And he touted New Hampshire's turnout rate, but he basically said that all these people talking about voter suppression here and across the country are sort of, it's much ado about nothing. And the real problem is that people don't want to vote bad enough. So I wanted to see
I think he's wrong. We make it very, very inconvenient. I mean, I talk about this with the young people on my campaign. Our goal is to convince the maximum number of people to go buy toothpaste on a particular Tuesday in November between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. and when they get there, to buy our brand of toothpaste. I mean, who would do that? Like, you can't do that other than maybe this lottery ticket that's whatever, $1.5 billion. But how you motivate people to participate in something, make it more convenient. Just look on the television, the people that are early voting all over this country. If we made it more convenient, trust me, Secretary Gardner, we would have more people voting. It's hard to vote. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. But most employers in the state do not give people time off to vote. Mm-hmm. We could make it a federal holiday so that people could get the time off to go vote, or at least at a minimum encourage employers to give people an hour to go vote. Trust me, I was a working mom. You drop your kids at childcare, you go to work, you gotta pick them up, get to the grocery store, get home. I can imagine if it's raining and they're crying, you simply decide life's too short. It's going to happen without me. And that's a shame. Every person over age 18 should participate in our democracy. And it's a threat to our democracy if they don't. And he, of all people, should not be standing in the way of that.
Okay.
But when you say it, we should be making it easier to vote. It's not. Do you feel that it's harder for people?
I feel that
the system of going and voting, not necessarily that people's lives are busier, but
no, it certainly has been across this country. Look at Georgia, where they're closing voting stations in African American neighborhoods, and look at what they tried to do to the students here. I'm glad that Judge Brown enjoined, because there was a great deal of confusion on the campuses. I was talking about it up at Dartmouth the other day with students. They would have to go to the, they're here for 4 years. That 4 years is an extensive time in their life. Their life is only 18 years long. So this is where their adulthood starts and where their habits are formed for voting. We should be encouraging them. But they would have to go to the Office of Residential Life to get a piece of paper demonstrating the address of the dorm that they live in so that they could present that to register to vote. And that's a new burden, and hopefully this opinion will enjoin that and they won't need that, but already that has had a discouraging impact. Or another example, if you live off campus, they needed something in writing, and people say, oh, the lease. Well, the lease is going to have one person's name on it. There may be 5 people living in the house. Their name's not on the lease. Their name's not on the electric bill. Their name's not on any of the bills that are coming to the house because they're doing it by Venmo and they're living with a group. That's 4 out of 5 people that are discouraged from voting. So I think we should encourage people to vote. And the fraud is so minuscule that we can deal with that. Down in Georgia, they're talking about this is by state law. Now, look at my name. Ann Kuster, Ann McLean Kuster, Annie Kuster, Annie McLean. People call me all of those things. My legal name is Ann McLean Kuster, and my ID says that. But if I went in and on their rolls it had a hyphen and my ID didn't, I couldn't vote. That's not right. That half of America, when they get married, they might change their name. And that should not keep them from voting.
Okay. I want to go back to, you mentioned, Elon, that we may talk about immigration.
Yes.
And
I figured we'd come back to it.
And there are two different aspects to this. One is dealing with immigrants who are here and have been here, and you mentioned that earlier. And the other is, how do we deal with those who want to come into our country? And you also mentioned the president's rhetoric, and so, but that's a political thing. And the rhetoric of that aside, conservatives argue that in dangerous times in the world, and it seems that we are in such times, it makes sense to put a stop to, or at least slow down, how many people we're bringing in and vet them more securely. Is that a bad thing? Or
Having strong borders and vetting people coming to our country, definitely not a bad thing. I am all for it. And that's what that comprehensive immigration reform that's 5.5 years old passed the Senate had $48 billion in improving our security at the border, and would have gone a long way, particularly over the last 5.5 years, to vet people coming into the country. So don't misunderstand me on that. I am very strong on strong borders, and I'm very strong on vetting people coming in. The problem with the rhetoric and the policy out of this administration here in New Hampshire is that we need workers. Every day I talk to companies, all different kinds of employers, and we've got 2.7% unemployment. So I visit dairy farmers who can't find workers because they can't get H-2B visas anymore because they can't, because they've cut back on those, or the delays, or the caps. I talk to ski areas and summer attractions who you relied on seasonal employees who can't find workers, all kinds of small businesses in the North Country that typically would have stayed open through the foliage season to Columbus Day, but had to close Labor Day because they didn't have people to make the beds or serve the food or run the attractions. I talked to high tech. I just talked to someone last night begging me about this, a high-tech company up in the Hanover area, but it's true in Nashua and Keene and all across the southern tier as well. They need people to work. And the delays and the caps and the obstruction of legitimate legal immigration is the objection that I have. One thing that my opponent and I do agree on is he has a very strong immigration story, and he's proud of it, and I agree with him that there should be a distinction between immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And when I went down to the border, because I was so concerned about the family separation policy of this administration, which I think is un-American, and it was abhorrent. It was a stain on our record in terms of human rights. And I wanted to bear witness. And the people that I met were asylum seekers. They were fleeing persecution, threats to their life, violence. I met a woman who had to run with her children and grab her niece because her sister had been murdered and their small business had been torched. You know, these people are fleeing for their life, and we should be accepting them, discussing their asylum claims, getting the evidence behind that, making a thoughtful decision about that. We shouldn't be putting them into a federal penitentiary in Seattle and sending their children to Michigan and not keeping track of where they are. So one of the ideas that I've had is why don't we, in these countries, particularly Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador right now, why don't we consider having them seek asylum with our embassy in the home country? Why? Obviously, there's a great deal of oppression right now. There's violence, there's criminal activity, that people are fleeing for their lives 1,000 miles across the border through the desert and everything else. Why don't we say, come in, we will consider your claim for asylum. You don't have to make that trip. And if we think that you should be granted asylum based upon our standards for that, then we will help you get there. But otherwise, don't come. Because what we have right now is it's a human tragedy at the border. And the way the U.S. government is dealing with it is just trying to shut down the border. They leave people out there in the sun for 10 days with no water or food or facilities, and then they're surprised when they sneak around and try to cross the river in a place that's not legal. That's not an effective policy.
Maybe we can bundle our last two questions, or we have what, like 3 minutes left? Is it?
Go for it.
Yeah,
Whatever you'd like.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So
for it.
the first one, I guess, we just a quick one, which is that Speaker Pelosi has kind of carved out this kind of territory here Minority Leader Pelosi at this point. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. She's carved out this territory as saying that if the Democrats were to take the House, she would serve as Speaker on a temporary basis, which is now opened up the kind of speculation of who would come after. So who would you prefer to be Speaker in an ideal world, just quickly, and then we can move on to it.
I think we have a lot of terrific leadership coming, and I think some of the names that people might recognize, if you're following the Intelligence Committee and you've seen Adam Schiff on television from California, very capable leader. My roommate, good friend, Catherine Clark from Massachusetts, is running for vice chair of our caucus. Joe Kennedy is a very capable leader. Steny Hoyer still has a great deal of potential in our caucus in terms of a broad representation. So I don't know what the leader's plans are. I don't think we'll know till after the election what she'll decide and how that will all go down. But I'm very confident that we have terrific leaders coming up through our caucus, and that the American people will see the real depth and breadth of our caucus, and the country will be in good hands.
Right. So we'll
If I could just add, it's somewhat related. If the Democrats were to take control of the House following these elections, do you think they would be well served to pursue impeachment proceedings?
I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we know until Mr. Mueller comes back with his investigation as to whether there are even grounds for high crimes and misdemeanors for any kind of proceeding to start. So I think what's important is that we protect the investigation. I get very nervous when the president talks about firing the Attorney General Sessions, or firing Rod Rosenstein, or firing Mr. Mueller. And given the chaos in the White House that I observed through the Bob Woodward book, I'd be very concerned about that for our democracy, but I don't think we're there yet as to what the next step will be.
And we also just wanted to ask about Saudi Arabia, obviously with the apparent murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So I guess specifically, President Trump obviously has kind of been hesitant to fully condemn the Saudis, and he seems to be protecting Mohammed bin Salman quite a bit. I just wanted to know how you think Congress should approach Saudi Arabia, specifically in how we would relate to Yemen and Iran. Like, for example, if you thought sanctions would be an approach, how strategically that would affect our relationship with those two countries that Saudi Arabia obviously serves as quite a significant buffer between.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say that I've been shocked by the president's response. To me, the First Amendment and journalism is the cornerstone to our democracy, and that the idea that Saudi Arabia put out a hit to murder a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, who wrote for the Washington Post, an American paper, lived in Virginia in the United States, I think is abhorrent. And the entire world is responding to that. And the president has been, as you say, slow, and in fact gives the appearance that he's protecting the Saudis from that, from the consequences. Look, I think there's a range of diplomatic responses for the United States, and they range from, I had said yesterday we should consider the removal of the ambassador here in the U.S. I think today that is in the news about a group of Saudis that have lost their visas and their right to be here. I think that's the sort of step one. Mm-hmm. I think Congress should consider sanctions, and we should be having hearings and a full investigation and bring in the authorities from Turkey, where the Saudi embassy was located in Istanbul, show us the investigation. Apparently there are tapes, audio tapes at least, maybe videotapes. It looks entirely premeditated. I mean, I don't know if you saw the pictures of one of the Saudis wearing the clothing of Mr. Khashoggi around the Istanbul, sort of trying to be a doppelganger, if you will, that he was still alive. I mean, that's very premeditated. That's not a fist fight. That's something. So I think everything should be on the table. And I think sanctions should be on the table.
Yeah.
We're good? We did it? Want to keep talking? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and for your interest in this race. And hopefully the democracy is alive and well.